Taylor County was split off as a separate governmental region from Madison County in 1856, with Rosehead established as its county seat. It was a sparsely populated farming community, but later experienced growth with the introduction of the turpentine and timber industries. In 1875, Rosehead was renamed Perry, and in 1904, not quite 50 years after Taylor County was founded, John Henry Parker was elected to be its sheriff. John, a third-generation North Floridian, was the owner of significant land holdings in and around Perry by the 1920s. He was 42 years old and in his fourth term as Taylor County Sheriff when he married Nellie Keesler. The daughter of Joseph David and Adosia Henderson Keesler, she met John while working as a sales lady at S.H. Peacock & Company department store, later called the Emporium. Being sheriff, however, was a rough business, and Nellie would only marry John on the condition that he would not run for re-election for a fifth term starting in January 1921. He agreed, and the wedding of Sheriff Parker and his bride was conducted by Reverend A.E. Calkins of the First Baptist Church of Perry on February 22, 1920. John and Nellie moved into the sheriff's family quarters on the second floor of the old jailhouse on Washington Street after the wedding. Designed by the same architect who drafted the plans for the Taylor County Courthouse, the jail was built in 1912 on land that was sold to the county by none other than John Henry Parker. Looking from the north side of the jail, the courthouse stands in the background. The former First Methodist Church is on the left, which was later converted into a residence and occupied by Ralph Carlton and his family. The Parkers' first child, John Henry Parker, Jr., was born on December 6, 1920, in the family quarters of the old jailhouse. He was delivered by Dr. James Weeks, who happened to be an uncle of John's future wife, Betty Clark. John later enjoyed telling people that he was born in jail, and was in no hurry to clarify that his father had been the Taylor County Sheriff at the time. At the end of his tenure as sheriff, in January of 1921, John Parker Sr. moved his wife, Nellie, and one-month-old son into a house on North Jefferson Street, which is currently occupied by Ziegler's Florist Shop. They lived there a short time while the house on Bay Street, which would soon be their permanent home, was being completed. In 1921, when John Jr. was 6 months old, Pastor A.F. O'Kelly and 2 Sunday school representatives admitted him into the cradle roll of the First Baptist Church. As it turned out, John was to be the oldest of 4 Parker children. His sister Jane was born in 1922, his brother Perry, nicknamed Son, was born in 1924, and his younger sister Ruth was born in 1927, a year after this picture was taken. John enjoyed the benefits of growing up in a small town with other children who would become his lifelong friends. This 1926 photograph shows the Perry children who attended Betty Jackson's birthday party, including John, his sister Jane, his cousins Catherine and Blanche Cross, and Betty Clark. Although John enjoyed fun and games as a child, he also proved to be a quick learner and received a firm foundation in academics at an early age. His maternal grandmother, Adosia Keesler, moved into the house at Bay Street with John's family when he was young. She was a retired school teacher and took it upon herself to make sure that John Jr. would have an edge when he attended school. It's said that Granny Keesler dipped snuff and rocked in her chair in front of the fireplace as she tutored her preschool grandson through a series of readers and other assignments. Years later, Dr. Parker would credit her efforts for his subsequent academic success. This later photo shows the Parkers' house during the historic 1958 snow. John's third grade report card from the Taylor County Grade School confirms that he had become a diligent student. He had more A's than B's, and the bell curve indicates that he was in the top 1 to 4 members of his class. John was also an entrepreneur from an early age. His mother Nellie would help him boil peanuts and then place them in bags to sell from his wagon. John's sales route followed the boardwalk around the old Taylor County Courthouse Square. He frequently could not make the entire circuit before he was sold out. John's uncle, Perry Keesler, owned and operated a seafood market in a building just west of the intersection of Jefferson and Main Streets. Uncle Perry let John use his store as a staging area for his boiled peanut runs and provided his nephew with iced Coca-Colas to sell and commission while on his route. John opened a savings account at the Perry Banking Company, located at the intersection of Green and Jefferson Streets. He was able to amass a significant amount of savings from his peanut and Coca-Cola sales, even during the Great Depression years. The Perry Banking Company was a logical choice because its owner, Joseph Scales, was a partner of Sheriff Parker's in the ownership of the Parker Motor Company. This building is also significant in that Dr. Ralph Green, who was a close friend of the Parker family and, more particularly, a mentor to John Jr., had his medical offices on the building's second floor. John was baptized in the first brick building of the First Baptist Church by Reverend T.O. Reese, along with a number of others, including his sister, Jane, and cousin, Blanche Cross, on the evening of June 8, 1930. The Great Depression left almost a quarter of Florida's population unemployed by the late 1920s. Because they had a farm, the Parkers were able to keep food on their table. Others were not as fortunate. Unemployed and homeless young men would approach the Parker residence, offering to do chores in exchange for a meal. Mrs. Parker's standard reply was, "My boys chop the wood and do the chores, but you're welcome to share what we have for supper." It wasn't unusual to have a stranger or two at the Parkers' dinner table. The Taylor County schools that John and his peers attended were located on a town block facing east on Calhoun Street. This photograph includes 5 classmates from his high school days. From left to right, Nell Dean Marshall, Cecil Huxford, Mildred Jackson Nola, Bill Clark, and John's first cousin, Catherine Cross. A particularly close friend was Ernest Cox, son of Luther Cox, one of the founders of the Gulf Telephone Company that was located on the second story of the Bloodworth Pharmacy building. Ernest used to say that he spent more time at the Parker house than he did at his own home when he was growing up. On weekends and during summer break, John and his brother's son would help their dad by driving new 1930s vintage Ford cars from Jacksonville to the Parker Motor Company, which was located in the building later owned by Fairport Communications on West Drew Street. John graduated from Taylor County High School during the spring of 1938 in a class of approximately 57 students. Here, John Parker Jr. is pictured among his classmates on the stairs of the old Taylor County High School. The graduates also included his cousin, Catherine Cross, and his friend Rayford Huxford, one of the high school's star football players and a study partner of John's. John had applied and was accepted to the University of Florida School of Engineering, beginning classes in the fall of 1938. Bill Clark of Perry was already in the engineering program when he arrived. John had no way of knowing that Bill would become his future brother-in-law. During his years at UF, John wore this beanie to let drivers know that he was a student when he hitched rides back and forth to Perry. However, John periodically had to sit out a semester or two in order to earn enough money to continue his studies. Intermittently, between June 1939 and February 1942, he worked as a rodman with a field survey team and then as a highway draftsman for the Florida State Road Department. He was on the construction crew that built the beach road from Perry to Keaton Beach. Years later, his friend Ned Bradford asked him why he had left such a big bend at the road at Dead Man's Curve, and Dr. Parker explained that the beach road was originally supposed to run north beyond the curve along the coastline, but they never completed it. In the years leading up to World War II, the U.S. Army Air Corps established a number of airfields in Florida. Perry was selected as a site for an air base to be used for training pilots. John, who had gained sufficient experience in surveying through his University of Florida engineering studies and the practical experience gained from the Beach Road project, was a surveyor for laying out the runways for the Perry Army Airfield, which was completed in June of 1943. By the late 1930s, the effects of the Great Depression had taken a toll on the Parker Motor Company. It was decided that John Sr. would run for Taylor County Sheriff again so that he could bolster the family income. He registered to run for the 1940 election. While he was running for sheriff, he was appointed to the Selective Service, or Draft Board, upon the recommendation of Florida Governor Fred P. Cone. John Parker Sr. easily won the election for his 5th term as sheriff. Here, John Jr. stands in front of the building where he was born shortly after the November 1940 election. A year later, a major historical event occurred that would change his life. John recalled that on the day after his 21st birthday, December 7, 1941, he returned to Perry from a trip to find everyone huddled around their radios, Japanese planes had attacked the U.S. Navy's fleet in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. On December 8th, President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared war, and America entered World War II. John completed one more semester at the University of Florida during the spring of 1942, but, with his father in the Selective Service Board, as well as being sheriff, he felt pressure to enter the armed forces. On June 22, 1942, he joined a couple of friends who drove to a Navy recruitment center located in the post office in downtown Tallahassee. The recruiter suggested that John could enlist at an advanced rank based on his engineering education and experience. He was leaning toward accepting this offer when a Navy officer, who had overheard the interview, suggested that he would be a great candidate for the Naval Aviation Corps. A few days later, John appeared before the Naval Aviation Selection Board in Atlanta, Georgia, and was determined to be eligible. He was told to go home and wait for orders that would be sent as soon as a pilot training slot opened. While John was waiting, he worked as a surveyor to lay out the runway for the Carabel Flight Strip, an auxiliary landing field of the Dale Mabry Army Airfield near Tallahassee. It was a job that no one wanted, as they gave him a horse and sent him into what was mostly a mosquito-infested swamp. He was more than ready to leave the project when his initial military orders finally arrived. The Navy orders instructed John to report to the Office of the Civilian Aviation Administration, located within the College of Engineering at the University of Florida, by September 14, 1942, to obtain his pilot's license. The training took place at Stengel Field, a privately owned and operated flight school located southwest of Gainesville, Florida. During this program, John trained on dual-seat biplanes and Piper Cubs. He developed long-lasting friendships with the other students and would periodically run into them at different stations during the course of the war. At the conclusion of the course, he was issued a Civilian Aviation Administration pilot's license. In December 1942, John enrolled at the University of Georgia in Athens for a 13-week ground school. While in Athens, John received word that his friend, Rayford Gordon Huxford, a Navy fighter pilot, had been killed in a plane crash on February 1, 1943. His request for leave to attend the funeral was denied because the Navy couldn't afford for any cadets to fall behind on the tight training schedule. Later that month, after completing ground school, Cadet Parker was next sent to a 14-week navigation course operated by Pan American Airways in Hollywood, Florida. Before being allowed to train on the Advanced Norden bomb sight, which provided unprecedented accuracy in high-altitude bombing, each cadet had to take a solemn oath to keep the details of the bomb sight secret. John Parker and his classmates, Sandman Higgins, the Phantom Smithson, and Zoot Suit Saluski, graduated and were commissioned as ensigns in the U.S. Naval Reserve in July of 1943. To obtain the Navigator bombardiers required for the new long-range B-24 bombers, the Navy approached those who had graduated in the top third of the navigation school and asked them to postpone their pilot training for 1 year to help meet the immediate needs for bombardiers. John was one of the graduates selected for this program. Ensign Parker trained as a large aircraft navigator bombardier at Banana River Naval Air Station at Cocoa Beach, Florida. Here, John and his comrades are posing in front of one of the twin-engine Beechcraft planes in which they trained. After completing his course requirements, he next received orders to join a naval transport unit at the Patuxent River Naval Air Station in Maryland in November of 1943. Patuxent Naval Air Station was a top-secret research and development facility for jet aircraft and radar technologies. Even saying the word radar to off-base personnel was a court-martial offense. The Navy even attempted to disguise the jet aircraft by attaching fake propellers to their noses when they were parked on base. While on leave, the new naval officer was able to visit home. Here, he poses with his mother outside the Taylor County Jail in December of 1943. While at Patuxent River, Ensign Parker was assigned as the navigator in a squadron of twin-engine Martin Mariner bombers, which were patrol flying boats. On flights to Bermuda, his crew would frequently lift off from the wintry airbase at Maryland bundled in heavy flight jackets, only to strip down to t-shirts as they approached the island. His time in Maryland was cut short by urgent orders that sent John and 10 other navigators to Camp Kearney, located in the desert adjacent to San Diego, California, in February 1944. There, they began familiarization training on the new B-24 Liberator bombers. Each had a crew of 10 to 11 men. John was assigned to be the navigator for Crew 8 of Bombing Squadron 116, the Blue Raiders. Here he's seen in a group photograph with his crew. Note the belly gunner, Airman 2nd Class Elmer Copeland, holding the crew's mascot. While the unit was initially assigned to conduct operational patrols off the California coast, the fog restricted their flying time and the squadron was restationed to Kaneohe Naval Air Station on Oahu, Hawaii. In July 1944, the squadron was relocated to Eniwetok, deep in the Pacific Theater, to support the task forces moving toward mainland Japan. This was right after U.S. Navy pilots had shot down over 600 Japanese aircraft in 2 days during the so-called Saipan Turkey Shoot. The bombers of Squadron 116 were employed in single-plane patrols lasting as long as 10 to 11 hours over endless Pacific waters, searching for submarines and other targets of opportunity. John then received orders to return to the U.S. to complete his pilot training program. His squadron's commander endorsed John's request to stay with his crew rather than return to school, but his request was denied and he was shipped back to the Ottumwa Naval Air Station in Iowa for fighter pilot training on July 24, 1944. On October 11, 1944, after John's departure, the Liberator flown by Crew 8 was on a patrol in the vicinity of the Bonin Islands when it was attacked and shot down by a flight of Japanese Zero fighters. Despite heroic search and rescue efforts, no surviving crew members were ever found. In a subsequent broadcast from Air Tokyo, the radio announcer, Tokyo Rose, read off the names of all the bomber's crewmen, including that of Ensign John Henry Parker, although he was no longer with the crew. John's mother, Nellie Parker, received letters of condolence from around the country, in addition to messages of sympathy from the parents of the other crew members. Luckily, John had visited home before starting his pilot training in Iowa, so his family knew he was safe. He had attended the Perry wedding of his close cousin Catherine Cross to Dr. John Hinchy on August 10, 1944, during the month of leave prior to reporting for pilot training. But there was still the difficult task of responding to the families who had lost their sons. The parents of belly gunner Elmer Copeland sent this letter to Nellie in the belief that John was missing in action, as was their son. John later recalled that he agonized over how to respond to letters of the family members of his close comrades and friends. For unspecified reasons, John didn't complete the pilot training course at Ottumwa Naval Air Station, but was instead promoted to lieutenant and assigned as a navigator bombardier in the Navy's Air Transport Command in the Pacific Theater. On this tour, he became a crew member of a Coronado flying boat. He arrived in the Pacific Theater in time to support Admiral Nimitz's island-hopping campaign toward Japan. Coronado squadrons handled high-priority transportation needs that required faster transfers than ships could provide. As the war progressed, Lieutenant Parker and his fellow aviators endured heavy flight schedules to support the successive island invasion by the Allies. The Coronados always received flak bursts whenever they came near these islands. John recalled that the Coronado planes sometimes lost their gas caps, which could result in a fuel leak. He came up with the solution of jamming potatoes into the open gas ports to act as caps, and he said that the idea caught on across the Pacific theater when it proved to be effective. During a stopover at Cavite Naval Base outside of Manila, the Philippines, Lieutenant Parker made an attempt to visit his boyhood friend, Sergeant Ernest Cox, who was stationed with an Army unit engaged in the Lingayen campaign against the Japanese. He hitched a ride with the Red Ball Express, a supply truck convoy that serviced the combat units on the front lines, where he was told his friend would be. In the process, Lieutenant Parker helped fight off an ambush by enemy snipers. When he finally made it to the command post, he was immediately herded onto a jeep headed back to Manila by an MP major who suggested that General MacArthur would skin John alive if he found him in a combat zone without orders. Occasionally, Lieutenant Parker ran into another hometown friend, Lieutenant Bill Clark, who was a pilot on a different Navy transport squadron. The U.S. bases at the Philippines and Mariana Islands were staging areas for the planned large-scale invasion of the Japanese homeland. In early 1945, Lieutenant Parker's transportation squadron was engaged in airlifting huge quantities of whole blood to be pre-positioned at these locations. Blood and medical supplies held a higher transport priority than even admirals, and John had to routinely refuse the transportation requests of senior officers during blood runs. Starting in late July 1945, they were flying in more blood than they had for the Iwo Jima and Okinawa campaigns combined. It was common knowledge that iced whole blood had a maximum usable shelf life of 21 days. This meant the invasion of Japan would likely be scheduled for mid-August 1945. John remembered that his crew was flying on a blood run on the morning of July 27, 1945, when they intercepted a worldwide radio broadcast by President Harry Truman, who threatened the utter devastation of Japan unless it surrendered unconditionally by August 3, 1945. Lieutenant Parker and his crewmates thought that the president was referring to the upcoming invasion of the island. However, he and the rest of the world soon found out what the ultimatum meant. An atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and another on Nagasaki 3 days later. John said that he was in Honolulu when rumors about a Japanese surrender began to surface among the American troops soon after the bombings. This was enough to prompt some naval personnel to start firing anti-aircraft rounds indiscriminately down the length of the base runways in celebration. He was happy to leave Hawaii the next morning. While he was flying to Johnston Island, John and his crew heard the official announcement of the Japanese surrender from the aircraft radio. When they landed in the former combat zone, they found that the frontline soldiers were also relieved about the end of hostilities, but more measured in their response. After the victory over Japan was declared, Lieutenant Parker was transitioned to Memphis, Tennessee to be debriefed and have his final official photograph taken. On March 25, 1946, within days of arriving back in Perry, John was sworn in as a deputy sheriff to assist his father and the one full-time deputy in Taylor County. He also visited the University of Florida with plans to resume his pursuit of an engineering degree in the fall. However, while on campus, he noted that there was not a soul from before the war that he still knew in the program, and the new staff seemed indifferent to the students' needs. In the course of his duties as deputy sheriff, John would frequently help carry stretchers with victims of automobile accidents up the stairs to Dr. Ralph Green's office on the second story of the Perry Banking Company building, since there was no hospital in Perry at the time. Dr. Green, a longtime Perry physician, was a friend of the Parker family who had always treated John Jr. as an adult even when he was a young boy. Ralph loved to hunt quail and would often make arrangements for John, at the age of 12 or 13, to hunt with him. During the spring and summer of 1946, John assisted Dr. Green with an increasing variety of medical procedures in what might be considered a paramedic's role today. Finally, Dr. Green sat him down and said, "John, why don't you just go on and go to medical school? You'd make a better doctor than an engineer anyway." Deciding to take Dr. Green's advice, John enrolled as a pre-med student at the Tallahassee branch of the University of Florida, which was then the Florida State College for Women, in September of 1946. Because UF wasn't able to accommodate all of the returning veterans who applied under the GI Bill, the Women's College accepted its first male students that year. On an occasion during this time period, Miss Sally Porter Clark was hosting a bridge card game at her home and asked John to complete the foursome that was needed to play. Her daughter, Betty Clark, was there, and while she and John had known each other since they were toddlers, the evening sparked a relationship that grew into more than casual friendship. At school, John completed a little over 2 years with heavy loads of biology and chemistry classes and labs. He thought highly of his professors, and also felt that their enthusiasm for teaching was heightened by having the GIs in the classrooms. These students were also the catalyst for change in the state's university system. In May of 1947, Florida State University was created. In July of 1948, John graduated with a Bachelor's of Science in FSU's first co-ed class. Since there were no medical schools in the state of Florida in the late 1940s, those interested in becoming physicians had to attend out-of-state schools. Unfortunately, his plans to apply to 12 different medical schools for admission to their fall 1948 classes went awry because the completed applications, including photos, birth certificates, and transcripts, were in an old briefcase that was stolen out of his parked car in October of 1947. His reconstructed applications arrived too late for any of the medical schools to consider him for admission that year. Upon hearing about his difficulties, a close friend of Sheriff Bud Parker, U.S. Senator Claude Pepper, made an 11th-hour call to the home of the Dean of Admissions at Columbia University in New York to plead John's case and try to get him admitted into their medical school. Unfortunately, the class roster starting in September 1948 had already been filled. John spent the next year planting and tending to 1,000 acres of Argentine bahia grass on the original Parker homestead off of San Pedro Road to harvest the seed for income while resubmitting applications to medical schools. The most significant event that occurred during John's break in his studies was his marriage on April 9, 1949, to the former Elizabeth Lucille Clark, or Betty as she was called. She was the daughter of Lloyd Bishop and Sally Porter Clark. During an interview with the Tulane University Medical School Selection Committee in New Orleans, Louisiana, John was asked what school he was currently attending. John replied that he had been farming during the past year since his graduation from Florida State, explaining that he always figured that he would be a country doctor and it would not hurt him to spend a year seeing how his patients lived. The Dean of Admissions was impressed enough with this answer that he offered John a spot in Tulane's fall 1949 medical school class. Among those who made recommendations on his behalf were prominent Perry attorney T.J. Swanson and Taylor County Judge Byron Butler. But money was still a problem. John was about 2 weeks late starting classes because he had to harvest, clean, and market his crop of Argentine bahia grass seed in order to pay the tuition and living expenses for that year. John later reminisced that all of his Tulane professors were very accommodating in helping him catch up on the material that he had missed the first 2 weeks of that semester. John and Betty settled into old barracks on campus that were used as housing for medical students. They had walls as thin as paper, sometimes making it difficult to study. The couple had little money to spend, but enjoyed an active social life with the other students who were similarly situated. John's father would periodically send them a side of beef from the Parker farm on the truck of a friend who shipped meat and seafood along the Gulf Coast. Toward the end of his first semester, John was inducted into the Theta Kappa Psi medical fraternity at Tulane. During this time, John and Betty started a family with 2 children, Jane and John III, born while their father was still in medical school. Then, on June 2, 1953, Dr. Parker was awarded his medical degree from the Tulane University School of Medicine. He received a letter from the chief of the pediatrics department at Tulane noting his knack for treating children and stating that his particular aptitude for dealing with young patients would always be an asset. He enjoyed pediatrics, which was fortunate as approximately 1/3 of his practice would be devoted to babies and children. The Louisiana State Board of Medical Examiners granted Dr. Parker a certificate to practice medicine in the state of Louisiana in June of 1953. Then, in August, John was certified to practice medicine in the state of Florida by the Board of Medical Examiners. Dr. Parker then began a 1-year internship in family medicine at Duval Medical Center in Jacksonville, Florida, where he met another physician who became a lifelong friend and colleague, Dr. John A. Dial. Though he had opportunities to practice in other places, John completed his internship and returned to Perry to open his medical practice in July of 1954. It turned out just as Florida Circuit Judge Hal W. Adams from Mayo later wrote in a letter to Dr. Parker in 1962. Judge Adams said, "When you finished your medical course and internship, you came right back to your old home grounds, as straight as a martin to its gourd, to start out as a doctor." In this day and time, such course is the exception instead of the rule. A doctor in a small town is a man of community importance, but in a big town, he's just one of many. Doctors Ralph Green and Walter Baker, who had been the core of the Perry medical community for a number of years, still had active medical practices when John opened his office. This photograph shows the 2 longtime Taylor County practitioners, along with the newer members of the medical staff, Dr. Dial, Dr. Parker, and Dr. C.R. Wiley. One of the most difficult decisions John initially faced was whether to accept the offer of his mentor and friend, Dr. Green, to join his practice. Instead, he chose the riskier route and established his own office on the corner of North Orange and East Bay Streets, the same month that Buckeye Cellulose Corporation opened its pulp mill in Foley. His third child, David, would be born later that year in December 1954. His wife Betty helped out by keeping the books, while also raising their 3 children. Dr. Parker provided routine medical care in his office, but it sometimes had to act as an emergency room as well. After the flood of June 9, 1957, Perry residents lined up around the block at his office to get tetanus and typhoid shots from Dr. Parker and his staff. And when a bus of migrant farm workers stopped at Capps, Florida, and ate some tongue nuts from the groves of the tungsten plantation, he treated the entire group for nausea and vomiting at his office that evening. He later said that someone eventually mailed him payment to reimburse him for his efforts. It wasn't unusual for people to bring fish, venison, or produce by his house if they couldn't pay their bills or to show appreciation for his good medical care. With no hospital in Perry until 1957, Dr. Parker made countless house calls to deliver babies, care for bedridden patients, and treat emergencies throughout Taylor County. This black bag, equipped to handle any medical problem, went wherever he went. His children recall that during family trips, someone had to sit with their feet on top of the bag, which was always in the same place, on the floorboard behind the driver's seat. By 1957, Dr. Parker was becoming a man of community importance, in the words of Judge Hal Adams. John was instrumental in lobbying to build the first Doctors Memorial Hospital near the intersection of Ash and Center Streets. With his practice having outgrown its original facility, John built and moved into his new office at 1211 North Center Street in 1960. From this new location, right across from the first and later second hospital buildings, his nurses would wheel obstetrics patients who needed to be admitted across Center Street to the emergency room. On October 19, 1966, Governor Hayden Burns appointed John to the Taylor County Hospital Board to replace T.W. Stackhouse, who had died that September. Governor Claude Kirk reappointed him the following year, and he served on the board through 1971. In In this role, he was an advocate for obtaining approval and financing to build the second Doctors Memorial Hospital, completed in 1969, next to the site of the first one. Here he joins Administrator Jim Arnold, hospital staff, and other board members in the groundbreaking ceremony. John was chief of the medical staff at Doctors Memorial Hospital for many years. According to a participant at meetings over which he presided, he let everyone have their say on any given matter, but when Dr. Parker finally spoke, everyone listened. During his tenure, he spent many hours actively recruiting to bring in additional needed physicians to the community. He also shared coverage of the emergency room on a rotational basis with the other local doctors, spending long hours on call or at the hospital. Most of the physicians were general practitioners, but they had to be ready to handle any kind of medical emergency that might come their way. John's youngest child, Beth, was born in 1961. She frequently accompanied him to the hospital, sometimes staying overnight with him in the doctor's lounge when she was older. Dr. Jim Rawls, who came to Perry in 1964, recently described what practicing medicine in a small town was like in the 1950s and 60s. Although they were not in practice together, he and Dr. Parker frequently covered for each other when one was out of town. They eventually came to share a number of patients. Each physician would take his turn treating the given patient while the other was on a trip. Both physicians kept medical records on these patients, which would be updated when it was their turn to care for them. Dr. Rawls and Dr. Parker shared a close working relationship for many years. During his years of practice, Dr. Parker saw numerous advances in medicine. He once said that when he started his medical practice in the 1950s, he could count the number of effective drugs available on his fingers. John also experienced the changing role of the family practitioner over the years, with the increase in the number of specialists, such as obstetricians and cardiologists. He valued the close working relationship that the Perry physicians had with specialists in Tallahassee and Gainesville, and was happy to be able to recruit some to Perry. John firmly believed that patients deserved the best care that they could possibly receive. On Friday, August 11, 1972, the hospital obtained its first defibrillator, and Dr. J. Orson Smith, a prominent cardiologist from Tallahassee, came to Perry and trained hospital staff and physicians on how to use it. On Sunday, August 13th, Dr. Parker was in the emergency room seeing another patient when Fire Chief Buck Sapp was brought in with chest pain and had a cardiac arrest upon arrival. John was the first local physician to employ the new defibrillator in an effort to revive Chief Sapp. This ultimately saved his life. In 2006, Dr. Orson Smith best captured the essence of Dr. Parker's contribution and reputation when he described him as a, quote, quintessential family physician from Perry, Florida, who has been the dean of the Perry medical community. Dr. Parker also had a dry sense of humor. He objected to the practice of ear piercings because he couldn't understand why anyone would intentionally wound themselves. When one of his nieces asked her Uncle John if he would pierce her ears, Dr. Parker immediately replied, "No, but I'll treat them when they get infected." After retirement, John would still get stopped in public places by people asking for his advice on various medical problems. When local realtor and friend Grady Moore once asked him how he handled such requests, Dr. Parker shared his approach. He would say, "Take your clothes off so I can examine you. Then I can tell what's ailing you." In addition to his leadership role at the local hospital, Dr. Parker also participated in numerous regional and statewide medical organizations. He served on regional health resources planning agencies from 1973 to 1981 and was the chairman for several years. John was active in the Florida Medical Association and served on many statewide committees over the years. He was also a prominent figure in the Florida Academy of Family Physicians, serving on the board of directors from 1976 to 1979 and as legislative chairman. He was opposed to governmental overregulation of healthcare and the effect it had on the doctor-patient relationship. He was also concerned about the shortage of physicians in rural areas in Florida and worked tirelessly with the Florida Academy and the legislature to find solutions to the problem. His interest in medicine literally took him to the far corners of the globe. In March 1978, he viewed a medical procedure in a Chinese operating room where acupuncture is employed for the management of pain as opposed to conventional anesthesia. Dr. Parker filled a diary with his observations during this trip, which required a special medical visa. The next year, he toured Russia with a group of physicians and had the opportunity to visit medical facilities in Moscow and Leningrad. On September 24, 1989, the Perry Women's Club was filled to capacity with family, friends, colleagues, and patients who helped Dr. Parker celebrate his retirement after 35 years practicing medicine in Perry, Florida. Also present were his longtime staff, including his sister Jane Gross, Louise Richardson, Katie Hensley, and Mary Inman. Decades later, former patients still recall the shots given by nurses Mary and Louise. A large contingent of Parker babies, who he delivered, were on hand to honor the man who brought them into the world. Dr. Parker received letters and cards from a number of patients at the time of his retirement. His patient, friend, and well-known local writer, Mary Lou Whitfield, expressed the following sentiments in a letter she sent. "This is to thank you for the feeling I've had these 35 years you have cared for my family, that you were my friend as well as my physician. It is hard to see you go. Meanwhile, my congratulations that you are leaving before we all totally use you up." Another patient referenced the multi-generational scope of his practice. "We just wanted to say thank you for all the years you have been our doctor and friend. You were always there when we needed you. Through 3 generations of both of our families, we have depended on you." Several of the notes voiced the mixed feelings many of his patients had, expressing their sadness in losing him as a doctor, but their understanding of his need to claim some time for himself. "It saddens me to know that I no longer have you to turn to in my hour of need. However, I can't think of anyone more deserving of retirement than you." Many of the cards noted his caring attitude toward his patients, going beyond just treating their medical conditions and diseases. "I really appreciate all you did for me and my family. I don't have words to thank you for the kindness you showed us. You truly are special and will always be." However, hanging up his stethoscope didn't mean that John was going to sit around in his rocking chair at his home on Green Street. Dr. Parker was also an astute businessman with interests in banking, real estate, and timber, and an active civic leader. He was a founder of the First Federal Savings and Loan Association in 1960 and was elected to chairman of the board in 1976, a position which he held until the sale of the bank to Capital City Bank in 1996. In 2010, Capital City Bank honored Dr. Parker and his close friend and business colleague, Ned Bradford, both emeritus board members, for 50 years of service to the bank and to Taylor County. Dr. Parker was also a member of the board of directors of the Citizens Bank of Perry, the Rotary Club, and the Order of Elks. Following retirement, he was able to pursue his many interests wholeheartedly, one of which was land. Back in 1959, he and Ned Bradford formed a partnership focused on commercial real estate, which lasted over 50 years. Out of this partnership came the Jefferson Street properties, on which Perry's post office and Walmart Supercenter were built. John loved his hometown and consistently campaigned to improve Perry and Taylor County's business climate and stature. He also had extensive land holdings with another close friend and mentor, Ralph Pinkerton, who John said was like a second father to him. The two went on hunting trips together out of the country, starting back in the 1960s, where they enjoyed the camaraderie as much as the hunting. Their trips included British Columbia and Merida, Mexico. Through his naval service, medical conferences, and hunting trips, John was already a seasoned world traveler prior to his retirement from medicine. By the time he took his last trip to Bermuda in 2007, he had visited every continent several times over, except Antarctica. Dr. Parker also loved to fish. A large portion of his discretionary time was spent on the Gulf, casting for trout, Spanish mackerel, or anything that would bite. This was one of the few places where he could get away from everything and unwind. He was so well known along the Taylor County coast that in 1980 he was crowned the king at the 6th annual Mullet Festival at Keaton Beach, with Miss Jo Ross as his queen. Dr. Parker's efforts to recruit physicians to Perry and Doctors Memorial Hospital didn't end with his retirement from medical practice, but continued into his later years through his encouragement of those in the younger generation interested in pursuing such a career. John passed away peacefully on July 22, 2012, at the age of 91, at his Green Street home of over 50 years. His wife Betty had predeceased him on December 7, 2008. They left behind 4 children that they had successfully raised and 5 grandchildren whom they had greatly enjoyed. Dr. Parker will be remembered primarily for his love of Taylor County, as well as his honesty, generosity, loyalty, work ethic, and sense of humor. In a fitting tribute to his many years of service to Doctors Memorial Hospital, the Taylor County Commissioners named the hospital's emergency room in honor of Dr. Parker on April 21, 2015. Family members recall, a few months before his death, Dr. Parker offered to help by going through the mail, saying, "I just want to be useful." Most would agree that this was a recurring theme throughout his life, and he had successfully achieved that goal with his many accomplishments.